Most people believe power comes from strength, or intelligence, or effort. History tells a different story. The civilizations that shaped the modern world were not built by the strongest warriors or the hardest workers. They were built by people who understood something far more durable. Control does not come from force, it comes from structure. Before money, before religion, before nations, there were systems that decided who ruled, who obeyed, and who inherited authority. Those systems did not disappear, they adapted. What you are about to hear is not mythology, and it is not conspiracy. It is a continuous pattern visible across ancient records, archaeological sites, and institutional design. From Sumer to Egypt, from gods to kings, from bloodlines to law, from temples to finance. This video is not asking you to believe anything. It is asking you to observe something, because once you recognize how power actually persists, you stop confusing participation with freedom. This channel exists for one purpose: to study patterns that history does not connect publicly, to examine systems rather than personalities, and to document how control survives across time, culture, and belief. If you value long-form analysis, uncomfortable questions, and material that does not fit into short clips or slogans, subscribe to the channel. If you want the full breakdowns that do not belong in public feeds, follow the Obsidian Record newsletter. That is where the complete frameworks live. Like the video, share it with someone who still believes effort alone explains outcomes. Subscribe if you want to understand systems instead of reacting to them. One important note before we begin. The visuals used in this video do not directly represent the events being discussed. They are used to maintain engagement, not to serve as historical evidence. The material itself comes from ancient texts, inscriptions, and archaeological findings, which will be referenced through narration, not imagery. What matters here is not what you see. It is what repeats, and once it starts repeating, it does not stop. Before gods were worshipped, they were recorded. The oldest civilizations on Earth did not begin with prayer. They began with accounting. Long before temples, long before churches, long before moral codes or commandments, human societies were documenting something far more practical: authority. The earliest known written records do not describe gods as distant, abstract forces. They describe named entities with roles, jurisdictions, and lineages. They list who ruled, who succeeded them, how long authority lasted, and where it came from. In the earliest Sumerian tablets, the concept of kingship does not emerge from conquest or popular consent. It descends, literally. The phrase used is simple and repeated: kingship descended from heaven. Modern readers are trained to imagine the sky. Ancient scribes were not. In the language of the tablets, heaven did not mean clouds. It meant origin, source, authority beyond dispute. Power did not rise from the people. It arrived already legitimized. The Sumerian king list is one of the most important documents ever recovered, not because it is mystical, but because it is administrative. It lists rulers before and after a great flood. It assigns reign lengths that stretch into the thousands of years. It names cities, dynasties, and transitions. And it does something modern history finds deeply uncomfortable. It treats gods and kings as part of the same continuum. The list does not say, first there were gods, then there were humans. It says, here is who ruled, here is how authority moved. Some figures are called gods, some are called kings. The format does not change. That alone tells us something critical. To the people who wrote these records, gods were not metaphysical concepts. They were part of governance. This is reinforced by the way the Anunnaki are described. The Anunnaki are often translated as those who came from heaven to earth. But again, this is a modern poetic interpretation. In the tablets, they are administrators, decision-makers, judges, authorities assigned domains. They argue, they negotiate, they enforce rules, they assign labor, they punish rebellion. They do not behave like symbols. They behave like a ruling class. When humans appear in these texts, they do not appear as equals. They appear as a labor force, created, according to the myths, to relieve the gods of work. This is not theology. This is class structure encoded as cosmology. And this pattern does not belong to Sumer alone. In Egypt, the earliest pharaohs are not described as chosen by gods. They are described as gods, Horus on earth, sons of Ra, living embodiments of divine authority. This was not metaphorical, it was legal. The pharaoh's word was law because it was divine by definition. There was no appeal, no higher court, no moral debate. The legitimacy of rule was built into the identity of the ruler, and this legitimacy was preserved through blood. Royal lineages in Egypt practiced incest not out of ignorance, but policy. Siblings married siblings. Fathers married daughters. The goal was not pleasure. It was containment. Divine blood was not to be diluted. If authority was inherited, then blood mattered more than belief. This is why genealogy mattered more than conquest. You see this again in early Mesopotamia. Kings claimed descent from gods not to inspire awe, but to eliminate competition. If authority is inherited from the divine, then no amount of strength or intelligence can challenge it. You cannot overthrow blood with effort. This is the first rule that never disappeared. Power seeks permanence. Permanence requires inheritance. Inheritance requires story. And story, when repeated long enough, becomes law. Before religion, there was legitimacy. Before legitimacy, there was lineage. The idea that ancient people believed everything literally is a modern insult, not a historical truth. These societies understood symbolism. What they did not do is confuse symbolism with power. Power was real. Power needed justification. Myth was the delivery system. And this is where the modern misunderstanding begins. We are taught to read ancient myths as primitive attempts to explain nature. Thunder became Zeus. The sun became Ra. Chaos became gods. But the earliest myths are not concerned with weather or seasons. They are concerned with hierarchy. Who rules? Who obeys? Who decides? Who inherits? This is why gods in these stories are obsessed with law, order, punishment, and loyalty. They are not cosmic poets. They are administrators. And when rebellion appears in these myths, it is never framed as philosophical disagreement. It is framed as treason. The gods punish disobedience not because it is immoral, but because it threatens order. This pattern becomes unmistakable when we move forward in time. As societies grew larger, authority became harder to maintain through proximity alone. You could not personally know every subject. You could not personally enforce every rule. So authority had to scale. This is where priests and scribes appear, not warriors, not philosophers, record keepers. The people who controlled writing controlled memory. The people who controlled memory controlled reality. If your name was not recorded, you did not exist. If your debt was recorded, it existed forever. And the ones doing the recording were not kings. They were permanent. Kings died. Dynasties fell. Scribes remained. This is why the gods slowly retreated, not because belief weakened, but because distance increases control. When gods are present, They can be questioned. When gods are distant, they become absolute. Authority shifted from I am divine to I represent the divine. That shift is everything. Because representation can be inherited, institutionalized, and defended without proof. By the time we reach later civilizations, gods no longer walk among humans. They speak through intermediaries, priests, prophets, kings. But the blood logic remains. Even when divinity is no longer claimed directly, chosenness replaces it. Chosen by God, chosen by fate, chosen by destiny. Different words, same function. And this is where history starts lying by omission. Because once authority is abstracted, lineage becomes invisible. Power no longer needs to announce itself. It just needs to persist. And persist it does. This is not where the story ends. This is where it becomes dangerous. Because when gods stop ruling openly, their descendants do not disappear. They reorganize. And the next stage of this system introduces a problem that ancient texts struggle to explain. The offspring, the ones who were not entirely gods, and not entirely human. The ones every culture remembers, and then tries to forget. Every civilization has a problem it does not know how to categorize. In ancient records, that problem takes a familiar form. They are described as larger than normal humans, stronger, longer lived. Born from unions that were not supposed to happen. They are not gods, they are not humans, they are something in between. In the Hebrew tradition, they are called the Nephilim. The word itself does not mean giant in the modern sense. It comes from a root that implies fallen, or those who came down. Not morally fallen, descended. Genesis chapter 6 is unusually brief, considering its implications. It states that the sons of God took the daughters of men, and that their offspring became mighty men of old, men of renown. Then, almost immediately, the narrative moves to destruction, a flood, a reset, a cleansing. The text does not explain why this union was a problem. It assumes the reader already knows. This is where later interpretations step in and dilute the issue. Angels, metaphor, allegory, moral corruption. But earlier texts are less evasive. The Book of Enoch, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, expands on this event in uncomfortable detail. It describes watchers, not spirits. Watchers, observers, guardians. They descend, they teach, they interbreed. They produce offspring who disrupt order. And the complaint is not sin, it is imbalance. The offspring consume too much. They dominate humans. They destabilize hierarchy. This is not a moral crisis. It is an administrative one. And the solution is not reform. It is eradication. This same pattern appears far beyond the Hebrew tradition. In Mesopotamia, Gilgamesh is described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. His strength is excessive, his authority uncontested, his behavior disruptive. The gods do not praise him, they restrain him. In Greece, the age of heroes is filled with demigods. Hercules, Perseus, Achilles, each born from a god and a mortal, each possessing abnormal strength, each associated with chaos, destruction, or tragedy. And each age ends, the heroes die, the gods withdraw, the world becomes smaller. In India, the devas and asuras produce beings who destabilize cosmic order. Entire cycles of time end in destruction to reset balance. In Mesoamerica, early ages of humanity are destroyed because the beings are too powerful, too loud, or too much. Different continents, different languages, same problem. Hybrid authority does not stabilize systems, it breaks them. This is the part modern scholarship struggles with, because it does not fit neatly into metaphor or history. If these stories are pure fiction, why do they all follow the same sequence? Arrival, interbreeding, dominance, disruption, reset. And why is the reset almost always catastrophic? Floods appear everywhere, not just in Mesopotamia and the Bible, but in India, China, Mesoamerica, and South America, even in Australia and the Pacific Islands. Modern geology confirms rapid sea level rise at the end of the last ice age. That part is not disputed. What is disputed is memory. How did cultures without contact preserve such similar narratives? The answer may not be in the water. It may be in what the water erased. When floods appear in ancient texts, they are not framed as random disasters. They are framed as solutions. The gods decide. The gods warn selectively. The gods preserve a lineage. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim is warned. Not humanity. One man, his family, his craft. Knowledge is preserved selectively. That matters, because if the goal was survival, more would have been warned. If the goal was reset, preservation would be limited. This is where archaeology becomes uncomfortable. Not because it proves gods existed, but because it proves advanced organization existed earlier than expected. Monumental construction before agriculture, astronomical alignment before metallurgy, complex planning before writing. Sites like Göbekli Tepe force a question historians are reluctant to ask out loud. Who organized this? Hunter-gatherers do not build ceremonial complexes requiring coordinated labor, shared cosmology, and generational continuity. Something preceded the settlement. Something ended. And something was remembered. The hybrid figures disappear after these resets. Not entirely, but quietly. They stop being rulers. They become legends. Why? Because pure lineage is easier to control than hybrid power. A god-king demands obedience through awe. A hybrid threatens the system itself. Hybrids do not inherit cleanly. They complicate succession. They attract followers through strength, not legitimacy. They do not fit bureaucracy, and bureaucracy is the backbone of civilization. This is why later systems work so hard to erase physical traces while preserving symbolic ones. Giants become metaphors. Demigods become myths. Lineage becomes chosen, and the record keepers take over. This is also where accusations of heresy begin, because knowledge of origin destabilizes obedience. If gods once walked among humans, then authority is not abstract. It is traceable. If authority is traceable, it can be challenged. So the origin stories are fragmented. Priests preserve ritual. Scribes preserve law. The physical reality dissolves into theology. This transition is not accidental. It marks the moment when power realizes something crucial. Distance is safer than presence. When gods rule openly, their flaws are visible. When gods rule symbolically, authority becomes untouchable. The flood narratives are not warnings about morality. They are warnings about memory. They tell you that knowledge was once closer, more dangerous, and less controllable, and that it had to be reduced. After the resets, something changes permanently. Gods stop mating with humans. Hybrid offspring vanish. Authority becomes institutional, and bloodlines adapt. Instead of claiming divine parents, rulers claim divine favor. Instead of walking as gods, they rule in their name. Instead of chaos, there is order. This is the birth of sustainable control, and it requires something new. Not strength, not divinity, continuity. Which brings us to the most important shift in human power. the moment God stopped ruling directly and systems took their place. Up to this point, everything you've heard still fits comfortably inside myth, gods, legends, ancient stories. But here is where the pattern stops being symbolic. Because the moment gods retreat from the world, power does not vanish. It consolidates. The same blood logic continues. The same hierarchy persists, only the language changes. What follows is not mythology. It is institutional design, and once you see how ancient authority converted itself into law, finance, and modern systems, it becomes impossible to believe power ever disappeared. This is where the story stops being ancient and starts being current. When gods stop appearing, authority does not disappear. It reorganizes. After the age of gods and hybrids ends in the ancient record, power does something very deliberate. It distances itself from the physical world while embedding itself more deeply into daily life. This is not decline, it is optimization. Direct rule is unstable. It invites challenge. It exposes weakness. It requires constant enforcement. Indirect rule is efficient. It scales. This is where priesthoods emerge as permanent structures rather than temporary advisors. In Egypt, this transition is visible in stone. Early pharaohs present themselves as living gods. Later dynasties shift emphasis. The pharaoh becomes the son of a god, or the representative of divine order. The god moves into the heavens. The system remains on earth. This separation is crucial. Once authority is no longer embodied, it cannot be overthrown physically. You cannot kill an abstraction. Priests become interpreters. Ritual becomes enforcement. Law becomes sacred. And sacred law is the most powerful form of law ever invented. Because once rules are framed as divine, disagreement becomes rebellion. This is not accidental theology. It is administrative design. The same pattern appears in Mesopotamia. Earlier kings claimed divine ancestry. Later kings claimed divine mandate. The language shifts, but the outcome does not. Authority remains inherited. The public role becomes symbolic. The permanent class becomes invisible. This is also when writing changes function. Early writing records transactions, labor, and inventory. Later writing records law, obligation, sin, and debt. Debt becomes moralized. Obedience becomes righteousness. Hierarchy becomes order. This moralization is critical. Because once hierarchy is moral, inequality becomes justified. You are no longer beneath power because of force. You are beneath power because it is right. This is the moment when gods become useful, not as beings, as concepts. The more distant gods become, the more absolute their authority grows. A god who speaks directly can be questioned. A god who speaks through texts cannot. This is why literacy is controlled. In nearly every ancient civilization, writing is restricted. Not because it is difficult, but because it is dangerous. Those who can read law can challenge it. Those who can read history can compare it. Those who can read records can audit power. So literacy remains priestly. The scribes do not rule visibly. They do not need to. They control measurement, time, land, tax, genealogy, and genealogy becomes the quiet backbone of power. Lineage does not disappear when gods retreat. It becomes codified. Royal families maintain blood purity. Noble houses track descent obsessively. Inheritance law becomes sacred. Even when rulers no longer claim divine blood, they claim noble blood. Different language, same mechanism. You see this clearly in ancient Israel. Early narratives describe direct interaction with divine beings. Later narratives shift toward law, commandments, covenants, Genealogies. The priestly class becomes hereditary. You are born into access or excluded from it. This is not spiritual, it is structural. Religion does not replace gods. It preserves their authority in a scalable form, and once preserved, authority can be exported. Empires adopt local gods. They merge pantheons. They absorb belief systems rather than destroy them. Because belief is infrastructure. Rome understood this perfectly. Early Rome borrows gods from Greece. Later emperors become gods after death. Not before, not during, after. Why? Because posthumous divinity eliminates accountability. You cannot challenge a god who no longer rules, but you can inherit their authority. This is how lineage survives public skepticism. When belief weakens, ritual remains. When ritual weakens, law remains. When law weakens, finance remains. And finance is where lineage becomes nearly invisible. Because money does not announce ancestry, it just moves through systems. This is the most important transition in the entire story. Power moves from visible rule to invisible control. No more gods walking among humans. No more demigods breaking systems. Only institutions, banks, courts, guilds, universities, religious hierarchies. Each claims neutrality. Each enforces obedience. And each inherits the same logic. Authority must appear legitimate. Legitimacy must appear ancient. Antiquity must appear sacred. This is why origin stories are preserved even when belief fades. Because origin creates inevitability. If something has always existed, it cannot be challenged. This is also why history becomes fragmented. The public receives myth. The elite receive record. The context is removed. You are taught what happened, not how power moved. Because understanding movement reveals leverage. By the medieval period, divine blood is no longer spoken aloud, but it governs everything. Kings rule by divine right. Nobles inherit land. Commoners inherit labor. And scribes still write. Only now they are called clerks, accountants, lawyers. The gods are gone. The system is complete. And this is where the final illusion is introduced. That modernity broke this cycle. That science replaced myth. That democracy replaced lineage. That merit replaced inheritance. But systems do not erase themselves. They adapt. And the last transformation of ancient power is not religious. It is legal and financial, which brings us to the final phase. The phase you are living inside right now. When gods disappeared from the world, power did not become weaker. It became quieter. The final transformation of ancient authority is the most successful one because it no longer requires belief. It no longer requires ritual. It does not even require obedience in the traditional sense. It requires participation. By the time modern civilization emerges, lineage no longer needs to announce itself. It embeds into systems that appear neutral, rational, and inevitable. Law replaces command. Contracts replace decrees. Finance replaces ritual. And unlike religion, finance does not ask what you believe. It asks what you owe. This is not a coincidence. It is evolution. Ancient power learned something critical over thousands of years. Belief is fragile, fear is expensive, force is inefficient, but obligation is permanent. Once obligation is normalized, control becomes automatic. The earliest financial systems were not markets. They were ledgers, tablets recording grain, labor, time, and debt. These were not tools of commerce. They were tools of hierarchy. Debt is older than money. Credit is older than currency. This matters because credit creates time dependency. It pulls the future into the present and locks behavior in advance. Ancient temples functioned as banks long before banks existed. They stored surplus. They issued credit. They enforced repayment through law and morality. Debt was not a failure. Default was. And default was punished not as a financial error, but as a moral one. This moralization survives today. Notice how debt is framed: responsible, irresponsible, trustworthy, risky. These are not economic terms. They are behavioral ones, which is exactly how ancient systems operated. As religion loses authority in the modern era, finance inherits its role, not as a belief system, but as an organizing force. You no longer obey because God commands it. You obey because the system requires it. Work schedules, credit scores, licenses, permits, contracts. Each one is a gate.
Each gate replaces a priest. And unlike gods, these systems do not need to justify themselves. They are framed as reality. This is Obsidian record. If you value analysis that explains how systems function rather than why they pretend to, like this video, share it, subscribe, and join the community for the full breakdown of what you're watching. This channel exists to map structure, not speculate about power. This is the final achievement of ancient power. It no longer needs lineage to be visible, but lineage is still there. Modern elites do not speak of divine blood. They speak of legacy, old families, established institutions, generational wealth. The language changes. The structure does not. Inheritance law quietly preserves hierarchy. Trusts replace blood rituals. Foundations replace temples. Even education functions this way. Access matters more than intelligence. Credential matters more than knowledge. Network matters more than effort. This is not corruption, it is design. Ancient scribes understood that control of knowledge creates control of outcomes. Modern institutions perfected it, and the public mistake is assuming this system needs deception. It does not. It needs normalization. If everyone participates, no one questions the rules. If everyone believes the system is fair, no one audits it. If everyone is busy surviving, no one studies structure. This is why ancient history feels distant and irrelevant, because relevance creates leverage. If you understand that power has always been inherited, structured, and preserved through systems rather than effort, then the modern myths collapse. The myth of merit, the myth of equal opportunity, the myth that hard work naturally leads to control. Effort has always been abundant. Control has always been restricted. This does not mean advancement is impossible. It means advancement without understanding structure is temporary. This is the part ancient societies never taught publicly. Because public understanding destabilizes systems, private understanding preserves them. That is why this knowledge was fragmented. That is why myths survived, but instructions disappeared. That is why history feels like disconnected stories instead of a continuous mechanism. And that is why modern power does not censor this information. It dilutes it. It turns it into entertainment, conspiracy, fantasy. Because dismissed knowledge is safer than forbidden knowledge, the system no longer fears belief. It fears comprehension. Once you see the pattern, you stop asking surface questions. You stop asking who rules. You ask how rule persists. You stop asking who is rich. You ask how value moves. You stop asking what is fair. You ask what is enforced. And this is where the documentary ends deliberately, not with conclusions, with orientation, because ancient power never handed people answers. It handed them frameworks. The gods did not disappear. They were replaced by systems that do not need worship. And lineage did not end. It learned how to survive invisibly. If power had truly been defeated, it would not feel this consistent. And if history were irrelevant, it would not repeat this precisely. You're watching Obsidian Record. If this framework clarified something you've sensed but never organized, like it, share it, subscribe, and join the community. That's where the deeper breakdowns continue. Thank you for watching, and if this kind of analysis matters to you, come back for what follows. The question is no longer whether this system exists. The question is whether you recognize when you are operating inside it. Because once you do, you stop mistaking participation for freedom, and that is the knowledge that was never meant to circulate openly.